Well, welcome to the ASIS Economist Board, where we discuss the current economic environment as it relates to industrial production. I'm John Nelson. I'm here with Keith Prather from Armada, and we're going to work our way through all of our industrial production models this month, each of them relying on 18 to 20 economic indices, and our data goes back about 20 years. In this video, and then in the 7 related subsectors, we'll dig into what's driving our forecasting models. And frankly, Keith and I were talking before we start recording, there's a lot of interesting things in the models this month, and I think you got to pay attention to some of the details this time. So Keith, how you doing today?
Yeah, I'm doing pretty good. I mean, both of us are having a little bit of technology issues today, so we may look like the old Max Headroom videos, for those who can remember Max Headroom, So anyway,
you just dated yourself, my friend.
I did. Well, the gray hair started it, so.
This is kind of the hair club for men, isn't it?
It is.
Okay, so I'm gonna go ahead and put up our first model. Let me see. There we go. Okay, so we'll talk about IPMAN, and here we go. As we said, lots of things to look into it. When Keith and you and I were talking about this earlier, we talked about the dip that started to rear its head. It was flattening over the last few months, and now it's really started to dip. A lot of the same stories, a lot of the same factors pushing on this. We mentioned manufacturing inventories. Housing was a little bit of a factor this month. And the other thing that, but one of the big things I do want to mention, and it's kind of a theme, I think, throughout the sectors, you and I were talking about this, that don't just focus on the orange line. Right. Look at the whole cone there of the variability. That's all part of the forecast. It shows you that although, right now the model says that we're going to go following this orange line, there's a lot of variability in it, which almost lets you see it could be almost flat, because the difference between the top end here where we were sitting that's 102, and the bottom of the cone is 98. Yeah, that's 4 percentage points, but that's, in the grand scheme of things, that's a lot different than saying 7 percentage points, which is where the orange line is. Conversely, you could go way down, but I really don't get the sense it's going to go down that far. Keith, your call.
Yeah, so I think a couple things here. I mean, we know that COVID, and specifically the Omicron variant, really kind of took a toll on the economy, kind of in December and January. And I say took a toll on the economy. Basically, what it did is it just created so many fits and spurts. We had a lot of absenteeism. Some companies were reporting as high as 25% absenteeism during this period of time when a lot of this data was collected. And so I think, to your point, listening to you describe it, John, I feel much better about it, because as you said, if you look at the orange line in this month's forecast and then compare it to where we were last month, what happened was Omicron was unexpected and just caused the line to trend at the bottom end of that cone of variability from last month. So not outside of expectations. What we did, though, is we just reset the curve essentially down to the bottom of our cone of expectations. So it's still, it's still positive. And I do think as soon as we get, another month or two of data, I do think that the forecast improves a little bit. Now, that being said, you and I have talked a lot about this, and we've decided that we're going to go ahead and we're going to trust the math right now. These particular models, and you'll have to correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe over the last quarter, we've been trending like 97% hit rates of accuracy, right? And then, and I think even a longer period of time, we're like in a 95 percentile hitting over multiple quarters. So we've got to the point now where we've been doing this long enough. I think we need to trust the data and trust the math. And what these 18 to 22 different economic metrics are telling us in this particular model is that there's some pressure out there. And we know it. I mean, those of you who are in manufacturing know that we've got everything from, labor pressures to raw material pressures, and inflation all over the board, from transportation costs, the raw materials, component parts, all those inputs. And then at the same time, we're starting to see some elements of stockpiling where some companies have enough of certain components and they've decided to start backing off on new orders. John, you and I were talking right before we jumped on that When we looked at the manufacturing PMIs, especially out of Asia this month, if we think about that as maybe the tip of the spear, we're starting to hear Asian manufacturers say that they were seeing a reduction in foreign new orders. So that would mean US, Europe, South America, starting to order just a little bit less in some of those products. And we could be seeing the result of certain commodities, certain component parts being in surplus, almost having too much inventory on hand, and then not enough of certain items, which means we continuously try to order those certain items that have been chronically in short supply to get our assembly lines going and to get products cranked off those assembly lines. But at the same time, we're still struggling a little bit with that supply chain congestion and trying to get through it. So I get it. I guess what I'm trying to say is I can find reasons why it's absolutely plausible to trust the math. All we can hope is that in the next 30 or 40 days, maybe as we do new updates to this and we get new data released, that we will start to see an improvement in it.
Sure. I mean, that's what the math is saying, and the things that I'm reading in the paper, from the novice standpoint, that's what I'm seeing. We had talked also right before we talked about this, about where unemployment was sitting, and it could dip. They're expecting it to drop into 2%. And the last time it dropped into the 2% range was in the 1950s, and then that triggered a recession as a swing back or a correction. So all that narrative fitting in with the new orders that you had just mentioned kind of point towards maybe that this is kind of really printing an accurate picture of where we're going.
Yeah, and I think there's a lot of uncertainty because, like you and I talked about, we're not giving away too much, but we talked about the fact that there are some housing metrics that go into the model. Right. This particular model, out of 20 metrics or so, a couple of those metrics refer to housing. And in December, housing had really a bad month. We saw some negative activity. Builder sentiment was down, and that was the data that would have filtered into these January models. But then since, as we're just publishing this, but as we start to get new data in, as we're waiting for all those 20 metrics to get updated, we just got a little bit of new housing data suggesting that maybe in January, some of that popped back up. So we would anticipate that the curve would improve a little bit. But again, just like we said, we watched that cone of variability, and what we expect, what we could have expected in December was that we may trend toward the bottom end of that curve like we did this month. We could also say that it could improve, but it's probably only going to trend about as good as the upper end of this particular line. So
yeah, and from the math, based on what you were just saying, from the math perspective, all else things, let's say, assume everything else is equal, and housing does come in with a little bit better of an outlook. That's not going to push it all the way up to the gold line. Right. It's going to push this the orange line up a little bit, but still well within the range that we're projecting based on how it does influence the model.
Yeah, we'd have to see 10 or 11 other metrics do exactly the same thing. And Omicron did have an impact. We know absenteeism was up. We know that some of the economic data did struggle a little bit in December and then even into January. But we're not going to get those whipsaw, whip back type of metrics coming out.
Sure.
Yeah.
So I want to hit the long range. It shows that dip, makes it look worse than what maybe it really is, but over the long range, you can see it.
Yeah, we don't know what to do much with this. I mean, you and I went in and we pulled the 10-year curves and looked at the 10-year curves, and even against the 10-year, this is a little bit weaker than what we had expected. And again, I do think it'll pop back a little bit, but if it doesn't, then we've got some economic trouble ahead. I mean, you hate to be sort of the Debbie Downer or the, that person out there kind of crying wolf, but the model is showing some economic pressure that has built and some risk that has built. And this would not include anything that would happen with like Russia, Ukraine, where maybe energy prices get affected. So there are some of those factors out there still kind of looming. This just assumes that we get through the Lunar New Year and China gets back online after the Olympics, and that the world kind of goes back to the way it was at some point in time, and that this is the resulting economic environment that we're in. So we'll see. I mean, it's not this particular story this month is not a pretty one, but I can promise you though, if you watch the other videos from some of the other sectors, that there are some real bright spots in industrial production though. So.
Okay, and then year over year, you can see it kind of actually shows up against other years a little bit even clearer. What we're talking about, that dash projection just kind of falling out and showing the depth of it actually gets us crossing into territory that we were seeing in September and October of last year.
Yeah, and
or 2020 rather.
Yeah, one other thing too, and this is a complete anecdote, but that's kind of what makes this fun. So this particular measure includes both durable and non-durable goods.
Mm-hmm.
And if you go walk through a Walmart or a Sam's Club or a Target right now, they're really full. So I went through a Sam's Club, and I've been paying attention to a former retailer way back in the day. But I can notice little tricks that retailers use when they use their overheads for excess inventory, or when they do multiple facings of products when they're really short on inventory to try to make the store look full. And for the first time, really in a little over 2 years, I can honestly say that when I walked through the Sam's, store was completely full. There were very few what I would call stockouts, where they played a couple tricks where you have a couple pallets of one item instead of like a single facing, because they're hiding the fact they're out of one item. But the store really was generally very, very full. Lots of overhead stock, lots of backup pallets. And so again, just an anecdote, but for a national retailer, where you've got really good inventory control and you've got, really good demand planning, they're looking pretty flush. And so that could be some of what this model's reading is on the non-durable side, like the consumer goods, the retail side of non-durables, that we're starting to see inventories fairly flush. I would throw in one more comment too, and this is probably the best place to put it, but we still have over, at the last reading, last I heard, there's about 180 ships still backed up off of US coasts. And the way these are now being tracked is you've got anchorages off the coast of Mexico now, where they've got calmer waters, a little shallower waters, a little easier to anchor, instead of them backing up off the west coast. And then you've got slow steaming taking place, where ships are leaving ports in Asia, and they're given a date and a time to be in the ports in like let's say LA Long Beach, for instance. And so they know what that transit time is, and so they can slow down and slow steam, they call it, across the Pacific, saving fuel, saving energy, but arriving at just the right time to be able to not have to anchor, but to be able to go right into berth. And so when you add all those ships up that are delayed, that have delayed berths or delayed port landings, we've got about 180 ships right now that are delayed. So a little over 1 million containers. Let's compare that to Q3 of 2021, which is normally the absolute peak season, right? Going into Thanksgiving, trying to get products on the shelves, we were at about 170. So wow. We have a tremendous inbound wave of products coming in that should be the types of products that'll get us all the way up to back to school, or I'm sorry, into summer months, and then after that we'll see a new wave. But yeah, it'll be interesting to see what happens and what supply looks like and what happens in the manufacturing sector when all those supply chain bottlenecks start to ease and we get all those products on the shelves. It should dramatically change output.
Well, and then the interesting thing is if you think in terms of the discussion that we just had, and we're seeing a little bit of that softening, and there may be a little bit of corresponding where the new orders are going down, all these things are hitting the US shores, and we're boosting those inventories, and now we're going to have possibly an inventory glut because new orders, as we're looking forward, aren't matching what we need to actually produce.
Yeah, and you and I talked, and we try to be really careful with anecdotes, because I've got a bunch of them. Like I again talked to another manufacturer who's missing like one little tiny component part that goes on the top of a faucet, but they can't deliver those faucets until they get that one little tiny part. And what's interesting is they know that once they get that part delivered, they've ordered like a year's supply of that particular one item. But the CFO of that company is already starting to push against their purchasing manager, saying, hey, we've got a lot of aluminum sitting there, we've got a lot of rubber sitting there, all those components that go into making the rest of the faucet. And he's kind of saying, let's call a timeout, time to kind of, sit back, let's relax a little bit. Aluminum prices are high right now. Rubber prices are high right now. Transportation costs are high right now. Let's take a timeout and let's let that stuff process while we're waiting on the green dot to go on top of the faucet. And then after that, maybe we get back a little more into a just-in-time type scenario, especially if we see some good signs that the rest of the global economy and the global supply chain is kind of getting back in cycle. And these are all things that the Federal Reserve has said. Federal Reserve just missed it by about a year is all, so.
Just a year.
Just joke. Yeah, exactly. I threw that out there flippantly, but
just a year.
Yeah, just a year.
Hopefully we aren't dismissing it by just a year either.
Right. Exactly. I don't think so. But yeah, anyway, interesting times. And I think there's still going to be a lot of volatility, even though, as you and I talked about, I do think we start to see a little more of a return to normalcy towards summer. In the automotive section, when we talk about the automotive model, we've got some really interesting news from GM and some others about microchips, and we'll cover that a bit later.
Okay. All right. Well, thanks, Keith. And I hope everybody enjoyed this month, and we will talk to you again next month.
Sounds good. Check out the other sectors. All right.
Yep.